Hello, I'm Jennifer Jean. Today I'm going to be talking about a wonderful poem by Cornilius Eady. To see my other new poetry community videos on project-based poetry collections and on my own poem, Object Lesson, published by Rise Up Review, subscribe to my Patreon page. Next week's content includes a discussion of a poem by W.S. Merwin and a video on my own poem, The Doors of Perception, which will appear in the October 2020 issue of Poetry Magazine. So, Faliure by Cornelius Eady was originally published as part of a cycle of poems called the Running Man Poems, which was turned into a libretto for Deirdre Murray's score for Running Man, a jazz opera. This work was deservedly a finalist for the Pulitzer. I read this poem in Eady's amazing collection, Brutal Imagination. And I hadn't read Brutal Imagination in a while, so when I was flipping through the book, I knew I wanted to do a video about one of Cornelius's poems, so I just flipped through the book. I found this poem. It shocked and amazed me, but I actually thought it was part of the overall series, or I should say the primary series of the book, the Brutal Imagination series, in which Eady writes in the voice of a fictitious Black man that mother and murderer Susan Smith accused of kidnapping her children. In this series on Smith, she's merged with what Eady calls the shadow, or who is the fictitious Black man, who often calls her mother because her brutal imagination gave birth to him. So for me, this poem works on all these levels, on the level of the Brutal Imagination series, because that's what I was thinking of when I read it, and then as part of the libretto, which I went on to read and loved, and as well as a standalone poem, which is something poets have to take into account when they're writing project-based collections. You know, do they want their poems to be standalone or to be read on their own? Not always, you know, but I felt that this poem could be read by itself. And since most of you might not be familiar with the poem, I have no idea, I'll go over the poem mostly as a standalone poem, but definitely look up all of Cornelius Eady's work, but especially Brutal Imagination, because that's just an amazing book. It's influenced me incredibly. Okay, so now I'm going to read the poem. Failure. One day my mother pointed up at the sky. I saw a sparrow being snatched up by a hawk. Someday, she said, you're going to grow up to be just like him. She was speaking of the hawk, but I was thinking about the sparrow, and it didn't matter that I turned my eyes away before its bloody feathers could hit the ground. One day, she promised, the world's going to surrender everything to what my shadow demands. But I didn't feel the hunger that keeps his talons sharp. I thought about the dark cloud that dropped upon that poor sparrow's breast. Then I felt her hand fall lightly on my shoulder. Okay, I hope I did that poem justice in my reading. I want to share with you right now some of my notations on this poem. Okay, here are some of my notations. I'm going to scroll through these really quick and take a quick look at those. There's a lot I'm going to talk about, especially about the tension or juxtaposition between the adult and child perspective, because I think that that's a key to this poem as, again, a standalone poem. So this poem was one of the few in my copy of Brutal Imagination which wasn't notated. Actually, the former owner of this book, which I bought at a used bookstore, I love buying books at used bookstores, because I might find books where former owners have written in them and notated them, and the notations are all over this book except for on this one poem. So in some ways, I got to do my own full notation without the influence of this unknown friend of mine who owned this this book before me. So it's a lot of fun. And if we ever meet up, you and I, you can ask me to show you those notations, and I will do so. It's pretty amazing. But before I continue, if you're watching this video on YouTube, please take time now to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell below. As well, please know that the bulk of this video and other poetry-related content is available to my patrons on Patreon. and will soon be available as well on my locals page. On YouTube, in the description below, you can find links to purchase Brutal Imagination. As well, you can find links to my Patreon, Twitter, Instagram, and website. If you're watching this on Instagram, you can find links to all these things in my bio. Okay, let's get started.